The rise and ruin of the Phipps Estate, America's steel palace that time erased. In the summer of 1916, on a windswept bluff overlooking the shimmering expanse of Long Island Sound, a procession of trucks rolled through wrought iron gates tall enough to dwarf a man on horseback. They carried marble quarried from the mountains of Italy, timber hewn from ancient forests, bronze fixtures cast in the workshops of master craftsmen whose names would never appear in any history book. The destination was a construction site unlike any America had ever witnessed, a palace rising from the earth with a speed and scale that seemed to mock the very laws of nature. Locals who gathered at the property's edge whispered that you could hear the hammering from 3 miles away, that the estate being built here would rival anything in Europe, that the man behind it possessed wealth so vast it could reshape entire cities. They were right on all counts. But what they could not know, standing there in the golden light of that long-ago afternoon, was that within a single generation, this monument to American industrial might would be abandoned, vandalized, and ultimately erased so completely that most people today have never heard its name. How does a palace disappear? How does a fortune built on the very steel that frames our modern world crumble into dust and memory? And what does its vanishing tell us about the true cost of the American dream? The man responsible for this audacious project was Henry Phipps Jr., though to call him merely wealthy would be like calling the ocean damp. By 1916, Phipps was one of the 5 richest men in America, a baron of the Gilded Age whose personal fortune exceeded $200 million, equivalent to nearly $6 billion in today's currency. But unlike the flamboyant Vanderbilts or the publicity-seeking Astors, Phipps was a ghost in the machine of American capitalism, a figure so intensely private that entire books about the era's great fortunes mention him only in footnotes. This was a man who, when pressed by journalists, would claim he was merely comfortable, who traveled under assumed names, who insisted his children never speak to reporters. His wealth was steel wealth, forged in the blast furnaces of Pittsburgh alongside his childhood friend and business partner, Andrew Carnegie. While Carnegie's name would adorn libraries and concert halls, while his face would appear on magazine covers and his opinions would shape public discourse, Phipps remained in the shadows, accumulating power and fortune with the quiet efficiency of a master accountant. Which is precisely what he had been. The story begins not in the gilded corridors of power but in the sooty alleyways of 1840s Pittsburgh, in a modest shoemaker's shop where a German immigrant named Henry Phipps Sr. struggled to support his growing family. Young Henry Jr. grew up in a wooden house on 2nd Avenue, in a neighborhood where the air tasted of coal smoke and the night sky glowed orange from the furnaces that lined the Monongahela River. His playmate was a Scottish boy named Andrew Carnegie, barely a year older, whose family occupied equally humble circumstances. The 2 boys shared everything: marbles, adventures along the riverbank, dreams of escaping the crushing poverty that surrounded them. But where Carnegie was charismatic and bold, young Phipps was cautious and methodical, the kind of child who saved his pennies in a tobacco tin and could calculate compound interest in his head before he turned 12. These traits would prove complementary. When Carnegie, at age 13, secured a job as a telegraph messenger boy, it was Phipps who helped him practice Morse code by lamplight, drilling him on the patterns until Carnegie could translate at speeds that impressed his employers. When Carnegie later began investing his meager earnings in railroad stocks and oil ventures, it was Phipps who kept his books, who tracked every expenditure with the precision of a Swiss watchmaker. And when, in 1861, Carnegie decided to invest in a small iron mill along the Allegheny River, it was Phipps who scraped together $500, his entire savings from working in his father's shoe shop, to buy a partnership stake. That $500 would become the seed of one of the greatest industrial fortunes in American history. But the path from iron mill to steel empire would be paved with brutal labor, technological revolution, and a willingness to exploit every advantage the American system offered, regardless of the human cost. The transformation began in the years following the Civil War, when America's railroad network exploded across the continent like an iron vine seeking the sun. Rails meant iron, and iron meant money, but iron rails were brittle, prone to shattering under heavy loads, requiring constant replacement. The future belonged to steel, everyone knew it, but the process of converting iron into steel remained expensive, slow, and unpredictable. Then, in 1856, an English inventor named Henry Bessemer had patented a revolutionary method: blast air through molten pig iron to burn away impurities, producing steel in minutes rather than hours. The Bessemer process would industrialize the world, but in 1860s America, few manufacturers had the capital or courage to invest in the massive converters the process required. Carnegie and Phipps did. In 1873, they broke ground on the Edgar Thomson Steel Works in Braddock, Pennsylvania, a facility designed from the ground up around Bessemer converters, built on a scale that horrified their competitors and thrilled their bankers. Phipps's contribution to the venture was characteristically invisible but essential. He negotiated contracts with railroad companies, managed the complex finances, and implemented cost accounting methods so detailed that Carnegie could tell you the cost of producing a single ton of steel rails down to the fraction of a cent. The mill was a cathedral of fire and noise, a place where immigrant workers, many fresh from the farms of Eastern Europe, labored 12-hour shifts in heat that could melt flesh, breathing air thick with iron dust, risking their lives every moment among the massive machinery and molten metal. Men died regularly, some were crushed between rolling mills, others burned beyond recognition when a ladle of white-hot steel tipped and poured. The company recorded these deaths in ledgers with the same dispassion Phipps used to track expenses: cost of replacing deceased worker, minimal; cost of production delay, more significant; cost to the worker's widow and children, not the company's concern. This was the age of what historians would later call industrial feudalism, when men like Carnegie and Phipps wielded power over their workers' lives that rivaled medieval lords, and the law sided firmly with capital over labor. The Edgar Thomson Works ran 7 days a week, 52 weeks a year. When workers in 1892 dared to strike for better conditions at Carnegie Steel's Homestead plant, Carnegie and Phipps's company brought in 300 Pinkerton agents armed with Winchester rifles. The Battle of Homestead left 10 dead and the Union crushed. Phipps said nothing publicly, but his account books show he approved every expense related to breaking the strike. Yet from this crucible of exploitation and innovation flowed wealth on a scale America had never witnessed. By 1890, Carnegie Steel dominated the industry, producing more steel than all of England. And Henry Phipps, who owned a significant stake second only to Carnegie himself, watched his fortune multiply with each passing year. He began investing his earnings beyond steel: real estate developments in New York City, vast tracts of land in Florida, an entire planned community called Miami Springs, stock in railroads and utilities and mining operations scattered across the hemisphere. His approach to investment mirrored his approach to everything else: meticulous, patient, diversified, and utterly ruthless in eliminating waste or sentiment. When he built low-income housing developments in New York, he genuinely believed he was improving the lives of the poor, providing clean apartments with running water and gas lighting. But the rents were calculated to extract maximum profit, the buildings constructed at minimum cost, and when tenants complained about conditions, Phipps's response was simple: if you cannot afford better, you should work harder. This was the social Darwinism of the age, the belief that the rich deserved their wealth because they were superior, that the poor deserved their poverty because they were weak, and that any interference with this natural order was both foolish and morally wrong. Then, in 1901, came the transaction that would cement Phipps's place among America's financial aristocracy. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in the world, proposed to buy Carnegie Steel and merge it with several other companies to create U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in human history. Carnegie demanded $480 million for his stake. Morgan agreed without hesitation. As Carnegie's principal partner, Phipps received a check for $50 million, equivalent to roughly $1.5 billion today. He was 51 years old. Most men in his position would have retired to enjoy their unimaginable wealth, perhaps engaging in the gentlemanly pursuits of philanthropy or travel. Phipps did the opposite. He took his $50 million and began building a second fortune through real estate and investments, managing his money with the same obsessive attention to detail that had made him indispensable to Carnegie. But even as he expanded his financial empire, even as he sat on the boards of banks and railroads and utility companies, Henry Phipps remained a cipher to the public, a name in the business pages but never a face in the social columns. His children were forbidden from speaking to journalists. His wife, Annie Schaefer Phipps, appeared in society pages only when absolutely necessary, and even then with obvious reluctance. The family maintained homes in Pittsburgh and New York, but these were modest by the standards of their peers, lacking the ostentatious marble staircases and Louis XIV furniture that defined Gilded Age excess. For years, this restraint seemed to be Phipps's defining characteristic, a Quaker-like simplicity married to capitalist accumulation. Then, in 1912, everything changed. That year, Phipps turned 62, his wife was 58, and their children were grown. Perhaps he felt the weight of mortality, perhaps he decided he had earned the right to visible grandeur, or perhaps he simply looked around at the monuments his peers were building, the Vanderbilt mansions and Astor estates and Morgan libraries, and decided that the man who had helped build industrial America deserved a palace of his own. Whatever the reason, in 1912, Henry Phipps purchased 235 acres of prime waterfront property in Old Westbury, Long Island, paying what contemporary newspapers described as a sum in excess of $500,000, a staggering price that reflected both the land's beauty and its location in the heart of Gold Coast society. This was the playground of America's aristocracy, where the Vanderbilts, Whitneys, and Guests had built summer estates that functioned as self-contained worlds, complete with private golf courses, polo fields, and stables housing horses worth more than most Americans would earn in a lifetime. Phipps, who had spent decades in the background, was about to build something that would eclipse them all. He hired the architectural firm of Carrère and Hastings, the men responsible for the New York Public Library, to design his palace. The brief was simple: create the finest estate in America, spare no expense, and complete it quickly. The architects proposed a Georgian Revival masterpiece, a main house containing 130 rooms spread across 3 connected wings, built from limestone and brick, topped with slate roofs and dozens of chimneys. But the house itself, as immense as it was, represented only the beginning. The estate would include a separate residence for the superintendent, housing for dozens of servants, stables capable of accommodating 50 horses, a dairy barn built to standards of cleanliness that would make a hospital jealous, garages for the family's fleet of automobiles, greenhouses spanning acres to provide fresh flowers and exotic plants year-round, a power plant to generate electricity for the entire compound, a water tower disguised as a Venetian campanile, and formal gardens that would require a staff of 40 gardeners working full-time to maintain. The entrance drive alone stretched for nearly a mile, lined with specimen trees imported from Europe, passing through gates designed by the same craftsmen who had worked on the Vanderbilt estates. This was not a home, it was a principality, a self-contained world where the Phipps family could live as their wealth and position entitled them to live, insulated from the concerns of ordinary Americans by walls, gates, distance, and an army of staff whose sole purpose was to make their lives comfortable beyond the wildest dreams of kings. Construction began in 1914, and almost immediately, the project became the talk of Long Island society. Observers estimated the cost at between $3 and $5 million, equivalent to nearly $140 million today, making it one of the most expensive private residences ever built in America up to that point. But even these figures, staggering as they were, told only part of the story. The real cost was measured in labor, in the thousands of workers who dug the foundations, laid the stone, carved the wood, installed the plumbing and electrical systems, cultivated the gardens, and performed the million small tasks required to transform architectural plans into physical reality. These men were immigrants, mostly, or the sons of immigrants, Italian stonemasons, Irish laborers, German craftsmen, Polish gardeners. They worked 6 days a week, often in brutal conditions, for wages that kept them perpetually on the edge of poverty. When World War I erupted in Europe in 1914, many of the estate's workers had relatives in the armies tearing each other apart across the Atlantic. But on Long Island, the war seemed distant, almost unreal, as the Phipps estate rose higher and grander with each passing month. The main house took shape first, its limestone facade gleaming white in the sun, its proportions calculated to inspire awe without seeming ostentatious, though of course it was ostentatious in the extreme. The entrance hall featured a floor of inlaid marble, walls paneled in English oak, and a staircase wide enough for 6 people to ascend abreast. The formal living room stretched 40 feet on each side, its ceiling coffered in the Italian style, its walls covered in silk damask imported from Lyon. The dining room could seat 40 guests comfortably, served by a kitchen complex that occupied an entire wing and employed a staff of 12, from the French chef down to the scullery maids who scrubbed pots in the pre-dawn darkness. Upstairs, the family's private quarters included bedrooms with en-suite bathrooms featuring fixtures of silver and porcelain, walk-in closets larger than most Americans' bedrooms, and windows offering views across manicured lawns to the distant glimmer of Long Island Sound. But even these private spaces were stages for display, decorated with furniture and art selected by professional consultants, every object chosen for its ability to communicate wealth, taste, and cultural sophistication. The message was clear: the Phipps family belonged at the apex of American society, their fortune as permanent as the stone walls that surrounded them. Beyond the main house, the estate functioned as a small village, a community whose entire purpose was to serve the family's needs and desires. The stables were architectural marvels in their own right, built in the same Georgian style as the main house, with stalls lined in mahogany and brass, a tack room that smelled of leather and oil, and quarters for the grooms and stable boys on the second floor. The horses themselves were among the finest in America, thoroughbreds and hunters purchased at auctions in England and Kentucky, animals whose breeding was documented as carefully as any aristocrat's lineage. The dairy barn produced milk and cream for the family's table, processed in spotless conditions by workers who wore white uniforms and followed sanitation protocols that would have seemed excessive in a pharmaceutical laboratory. The greenhouses were worlds unto themselves, hot and humid, filled with orchids and tropical plants, tended by specialist gardeners who devoted their entire lives to the cultivation of beauty for others to enjoy. And throughout the estate, a small army of workers moved in perpetual motion, maids cleaning rooms that were already spotless, footmen standing ready to open doors, chauffeurs polishing automobiles that gleamed like jewelry, groundskeepers trimming hedges into geometric perfection. These people were invisible to the family, in the sense that a properly trained servant was always invisible, present when needed, vanishing when their task was complete, living lives that intersected with the Phipps family only in moments of service. They had names, of course, and families, and dreams, but none of that mattered within the estate's gates. What mattered was that the silver gleamed, the lawns remained perfect, and the family never had to think about the mechanisms that sustained their paradise. By 1918, the estate was complete, and Henry Phipps moved his family to their new home. He was 68 years old, his fortune intact despite the war's disruptions, his health relatively good for a man his age. He should have had decades to enjoy the fruits of his labor, to walk his perfect grounds and sleep in rooms whose construction had required the labor of thousands. Instead, he had less than 2 years. In early 1930, he fell ill, the robust constitution that had carried him through 8 decades finally beginning to fail. On September 22, 1930, surrounded by his family in the great house he had built, Henry Phipps Jr. died quietly, his passing noted in newspapers across the country but never capturing the public imagination the way Carnegie's death had. Even in death, he remained what he had always been, essential to the structure of American capitalism but unknown to the American people. His will revealed a fortune that had grown to over $250 million, one of the largest estates ever probated in the United States. He left generous bequests to his children, established trusts for his grandchildren, endowed hospitals and housing initiatives, and ensured that his name would be attached to institutions devoted to public health and scientific research. It was an attempt at redemption, perhaps, a way to balance the ledger for a lifetime of ruthless accumulation. But buildings and endowments cannot change the past, cannot unwork the 12-hour shifts or bring back the men crushed in the mills or compensate the families driven into poverty when the company broke the unions. The past remains, immutable and judging, regardless of how much money we throw at the future. With Henry Phipps gone, the estate entered its strange second act. His widow, Annie, continued to live there, though increasingly, the great house felt empty and purposeless. The children, now wealthy in their own right, maintained their own estates and apartments in New York. They would visit, certainly, for holidays and special occasions, but the days when the mansion bustled with activity were over. The staff remained, because someone had to maintain the property, but now they cleaned rooms no one used, prepared meals for a solitary widow, tended gardens for an audience that rarely appeared. The Great Depression arrived, and while it barely touched the Phipps fortune, insulated as it was in trusts and diversified investments, it transformed the world beyond the estate's gates. Men stood in breadlines while inside the walls, servants polished silver and trimmed hedges. The contrast had always existed, but now it seemed obscene, a monument to inequality at a moment when America was questioning the very structure of its economy. Some estates opened their doors to tours, their owners hoping to generate income or simply justify their existence by sharing their beauty with the public. The Phipps estate remained closed, private, a world apart. Annie Phipps died in 1936, and the question of the estate's future became pressing. The children gathered to discuss options. They could maintain it as a family compound, a place for gatherings and holidays, but this seemed impractical given that each of them had their own substantial properties. They could donate it to a museum or university, securing a tax deduction and ensuring its preservation, but none of the local institutions seemed interested in taking on the massive expense of maintaining a property that size. They could sell it, but to whom? The market for estates requiring a staff of 50 and annual maintenance costs in the hundreds of thousands of dollars had evaporated. In the end, they chose a path that would have seemed impossible just a decade earlier. They decided to demolish it. Not immediately, not in a sudden dramatic gesture, but gradually, through a process of managed decline. The staff was reduced, then reduced again. Rooms were closed off. The greenhouses fell into disrepair, their glass panels cracking, tropical plants dying as the heating systems failed. The horses were sold, the stables emptied. The great house, barely 20 years old, began its transformation into a ruin. World War II arrived, and for a brief moment, there was hope the estate might find new purpose. The government was requisitioning properties for military use, converting mansions into hospitals and training centers. Surely a facility as substantial as the Phipps estate could serve the war effort. But the location proved problematic, too close to the coast for secure operations yet not close enough to be useful as a coastal defense installation. Negotiations occurred, letters were exchanged, but ultimately, the government moved on to other properties. The war ended, and America entered its post-war boom, but this was a new America, one that had less patience for Gilded Age excess, one where the new wealth was building modern homes in the suburbs, not palaces on vast estates. The Phipps mansion, already fading, became increasingly irrelevant. In 1948, 18 years after Henry Phipps's death, the family made it official: the main house would be demolished. A wrecking company was hired, paid a sum that seemed absurdly small given the building's original cost, and crews arrived with equipment designed to tear down what had taken years to build. The process took months. First went the interior fittings, the silk wallpaper was stripped, the marble mantels removed and sold at auction, the oak paneling pried loose and trucked away. Then the systematic destruction of the structure itself, walls knocked down, floors torn up, the limestone facade cracked apart with pneumatic hammers. Locals who remembered the estate's construction, who had worked on it or knew someone who had, came to watch. Some felt a sense of satisfaction, seeing wealth humbled, proof that even the mightiest fortunes could not hold back time. Others felt only sadness, watching beauty destroyed, regardless of what it represented. The gardens went wild, ornamental plants choked by weeds, pathways disappearing under encroaching grass. The outbuildings remained for a while longer, but without the main house, they seemed pointless, follies without purpose. One by one, they too were demolished or left to collapse under their own weight. By 1955, almost nothing remained. The land was subdivided and sold for development, transformed into suburban lots where middle-class families built ranch houses and raised children who would never know that a palace had once stood where they played catch. A few fragments survived, sections of the estate's wall, still visible in some neighborhoods, the water tower, preserved by local ordinance as a historical curiosity, scattered pieces of stonework incorporated into other buildings. But the estate itself, the thing Henry Phipps had spent millions to create, had been erased as completely as if it had never existed. How had this happened? How had one of America's grandest estates disappeared within a single generation? The answer lies not in any single decision but in the confluence of forces that transformed America in the mid-20th century. The first was economic. The wealth that had built estates like Phipps's was predicated on an economic system where a tiny minority controlled vast fortunes while the majority lived in relative poverty. This system worked, from the perspective of the wealthy, as long as the majority accepted their position. But the Great Depression shattered that acceptance, and the New Deal that followed fundamentally restructured the relationship between wealth and government. Higher taxes, stronger labor protections, social safety nets, all of these reduced the concentration of wealth at the top and made it increasingly difficult to maintain the lifestyle the Gilded Age had taken for granted. Henry Phipps had paid almost no income tax for most of his life. By the 1940s, the top marginal tax rate exceeded 90%. This didn't make his heirs poor by any measure, but it made the casual spending of millions on personal palaces seem not just extravagant but foolish. Why pour money into an estate when the government would take most of your income anyway? Better to invest, to shelter wealth in trusts and foundations, to live well but not ostentatiously. The second force was social. The reverence Americans had once felt for their financial aristocracy had curdled into something more complex. The Jazz Age had already begun questioning the values of the Gilded Age, but the Depression and World War II accelerated this transformation. The men who had fought in Europe and the Pacific had seen too much, had sacrificed too much, to come home and accept a social order predicated on inherited privilege. They wanted opportunity, not deference. They wanted homes they owned, not servants' quarters in someone else's palace. The GI Bill gave millions of veterans access to education and housing, creating a new middle class that measured success not in manor houses but in suburban comfort. In this new America, estates like Phipps's seemed like relics from another age, as relevant as medieval castles. Who wanted to play aristocrat when you could own your own home, drive your own car, shape your own destiny? The third force was practical. Maintaining an estate like Phipps's required not just wealth but a willing workforce of servants, gardeners, craftsmen, and laborers who would devote their lives to serving the family's needs for modest wages. This workforce had always existed because economic necessity forced people into service. But post-war America offered other options. Factories were hiring, the suburbs were expanding, opportunities existed that didn't require bowing to someone else's whims. The servant class that had sustained estates like Phipps's simply evaporated, drawn away by better wages and the dignity of work that didn't require living in someone else's shadow. And without servants, the estates became impossible to maintain. You could pay someone to clean your suburban ranch house once a week, but who could afford a staff of 50? Who even wanted that kind of lifestyle, with its implicit hierarchies and awkward intimacies? But perhaps the deepest reason for the estate's disappearance was more fundamental: it had never been built to last. For all its grandeur, for all the stone and steel that went into its construction, the Phipps estate was always temporary, a monument to a moment rather than an enduring legacy. Henry Phipps built it when he was in his 60s, enjoyed it for less than 2 years, and left it to children who had no real attachment to the place. It was a stage set, beautiful but hollow, a physical manifestation of wealth rather than a home in any meaningful sense. The servants who maintained it had no loyalty to it, they were there for wages, and when better opportunities arose, they left without looking back. The surrounding community had no investment in preserving it; if anything, they resented the reminder of inequality it represented. And the Phipps family itself, for all their millions, discovered what every generation eventually learns: you cannot buy permanence. You cannot transform stone and steel into immortality, no matter how much you spend. There's a photograph, taken sometime in the early 1950s, that captures the estate in its final days. The main house is already gone, reduced to rubble and empty foundation holes. But in the background, you can see one of the outbuildings still standing, and in the foreground, what appears to be a section of formal garden, now overgrown, ornamental shrubs turned into tangled masses of wild growth. Standing in this scene is a single figure, possibly one of the old gardeners or perhaps just a curious local, and they're looking at where the house used to be, their body language conveying a kind of bewilderment. The photograph is grainy, poorly focused, the kind of image that would be easy to overlook, but it captures something essential about the estate's fate. This is what happens when the dream ends. This is what remains when the money stops flowing, when the workers go home, when the family moves on. Just emptiness, and confusion, and the slow return of nature to land that had been forced into artificial perfection. Today, if you visit Old Westbury, you can find traces of the Phipps estate if you know where to look and who to ask. The water tower still stands, though it's been decades since it supplied water to anything, a brick cylinder topped with a decorative cap, looking vaguely European and deeply incongruous in a neighborhood of mid-century houses. Some of the estate's stone walls survive, incorporated into property lines and supporting embankments, so weathered and overgrown that most people walk past without realizing they're looking at fragments of a lost palace. And if you dig through the archives of the local historical society, you can find photographs, blueprints, newspaper clippings that document the estate's brief existence. But these are scraps, fragments, insufficient to convey the scale and grandeur of what once stood here. The Phipps estate has become a ghost story, a local legend that grows vaguer with each passing year as the people who remember it firsthand die and are replaced by generations for whom it's just a name, if that. What are we to make of this disappearance? What lessons should we draw from the rise and ruin of America's steel palace? The easiest interpretation is also the most superficial: hubris punished, wealth proving impermanent, the inevitable decay of all human works. This is true but incomplete, a moral so obvious it barely needs stating. Dig deeper, and darker truths emerge. The Phipps estate was built with money extracted from the labor of thousands of workers who toiled in conditions that killed and maimed them, who received wages calculated to keep them dependent, who had no share in the wealth they created. Henry Phipps was not a robber baron in the theatrical sense. He didn't revel in his exploitation the way some of his peers did, but he benefited from a system designed to concentrate wealth upward while pushing the costs, human and environmental, downward. His fortune was built on steel, and steel was built on broken bodies and broken lives. The estate was his reward for mastering this system, for being more efficient, more ruthless, more focused than his competitors. And when the estate fell into ruin, when it was demolished and erased, this didn't represent justice for those who had suffered to build his fortune. They were still dead, still forgotten, their sacrifices uncompensated and unremembered. The estate's disappearance changed nothing for them. But there's another truth here, one that complicates the simple narrative of wealth and exploitation. Henry Phipps was not solely a villain. He was also a philanthropist who funded hospitals and housing for the poor, who believed, genuinely if paternalistically, in using his wealth to improve society. His estate employed hundreds of people during its construction and dozens more during its operation, providing wages that, while inadequate by today's standards, represented survival for families who might otherwise have starved. The gardens he created were beautiful, the craftsmanship employed in the estate's construction represented skills and traditions passed down through generations, now largely lost. When the estate was demolished, something of value was destroyed, not just in monetary terms but in cultural and aesthetic terms. We can acknowledge this while also acknowledging the exploitation and inequality the estate represented. The world is not simple, history is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains, and the Phipps estate story resists easy categorization. What we're left with, ultimately, is ambiguity and questions that have no comfortable answers. Was Henry Phipps a great man, an industrial genius who helped build the infrastructure of modern America? Or was he an exploiter who enriched himself at others' expense and then tried to buy redemption through philanthropy? Can we admire the beauty and craftsmanship of his estate while condemning the system that made it possible? Should we mourn its loss or celebrate its destruction as a small blow against inequality? These questions don't have single correct answers because they're asking us to weigh values that don't reduce to simple arithmetic. Beauty matters, but so does justice. Innovation and efficiency matter, but so do the lives of the workers who make innovation possible. Legacy matters, but so does honesty about how that legacy was built. The Phipps estate is gone, erased so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard of it, couldn't find it on a map if you asked. In one sense, this erasure represents failure, the ultimate proof that wealth and power cannot buy immortality. But in another sense, perhaps it's exactly what should happen to monuments built on exploitation. Perhaps the most honest legacy is no legacy at all, just silence and the slow reclamation of nature, wild grass growing where marble floors once gleamed. Perhaps the truest thing we can say about the Phipps Estate is this: it rose too quickly, built on wealth extracted too ruthlessly, sustained by hierarchies too unjust, and when the moment that created it passed, it fell just as quickly, leaving almost nothing behind. And perhaps that's not a tragedy. Perhaps that's just the world correcting itself, slowly and imperfectly, pushing back against the idea that some people deserve palaces while others deserve nothing. But even this interpretation, satisfying as it might be, oversimplifies. Because the Phipps Estate's disappearance didn't solve inequality, didn't return wealth to the workers who created it, didn't fundamentally challenge the structures of American capitalism. The estate fell, but the fortune remained, sheltered in trusts and foundations, continuing to generate returns, continuing to give the Phipps descendants advantages that compound across generations. The estate fell, but other estates survived, preserved now as museums and tourist attractions, their origins carefully sanitized, their beauty celebrated while the costs of their creation are mentioned only in footnotes if at all. The estate fell, but America continued building monuments to wealth, just in different forms: corporate headquarters that dwarf the grandest Gilded Age mansion, private jets and superyachts that make the Phipps Estate look almost modest, new technologies that concentrate wealth even more efficiently than steel mills ever did. The game changed, the playing field shifted, but the fundamental dynamic remained: those with capital accumulate more, those without struggle to survive, and occasionally, when the contradictions become too stark, the system convulses, destroys some symbols of excess, and then reconstitutes itself in a slightly different form. There's a bitter irony in the fact that Henry Phipps, who spent his life avoiding publicity, who insisted on privacy to the point of paranoia, is now remembered primarily for a building that no longer exists. His philanthropic institutions survive, still doing good work funded by the fortune he accumulated, but most people who benefit from them have no idea who Henry Phipps was. His role in creating the American steel industry is recognized by historians but unknown to the general public, overshadowed by his more famous partner, Andrew Carnegie. What remains in popular memory, to the extent he's remembered at all, is the story of a palace that rose and fell, a monument to an age that America has spent a century trying to understand and atone for. Perhaps this is the legacy he deserves, not the grateful memory of those he helped, not recognition for his business acumen, but a cautionary tale about the limits of wealth and the impermanence of power. Or perhaps it's simply what happens to all of us, eventually, regardless of how much money we accumulate or how grand our monuments. We become stories, and then the stories fade, and then nothing remains but fragments and questions. The sun sets over Old Westbury now just as it did in 1916, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would look the same to Henry Phipps if he could somehow return. The houses that cover the former estate are dark, their occupants inside, eating dinner, watching television, living lives that the Phipps family would have found incomprehensible in their ordinariness and comfort. These people own their homes, mostly, have good jobs and retirement accounts, send their children to decent schools, take vacations, enjoy a standard of living that exceeds what royalty commanded a few centuries ago. They're not wealthy by the standards of the Forbes 400, but they're not struggling in the way the workers in Phipps's steel mills struggled, are not ground down by labor that breaks their bodies and souls. This is, in some ways, the victory that the estate's destruction represents, not revenge or justice exactly, but a rebalancing, a world where more people have enough and fewer people have everything. It's an incomplete victory, compromised and partial, but it's something. And yet, walk through the neighborhoods built on the estate's grounds, and you might feel a ghost of loss for something that was destroyed but perhaps shouldn't have been, at least not so completely. Because for all its associations with inequality and exploitation, the estate represented something else too, a vision of beauty and permanence, a belief that humans could create works that would endure and inspire, that would connect us to traditions reaching back centuries. The craftsmen who carved the stone and laid the gardens knew they were creating something greater than themselves, something that would outlast them and become part of history. They were wrong, it turned out, but their intention was real and their skill was authentic. When we destroy these monuments, even for good reasons, we lose not just buildings but connections to the past, to ways of making and knowing that cannot be easily recovered. The Phipps Estate is gone, but so are the skills and knowledge required to build something like it. The social contract that employed those skills was deeply flawed, but the skills themselves were genuine, valuable, worth preserving. We threw out everything together, and now we live in a world of suburban uniformity and modular construction, efficient and democratic but also, perhaps, a little diminished. This is the final ambiguity, the last uncomfortable question the Phipps Estate leaves us: can we build beauty without exploitation? Can we create monuments that inspire without requiring the submission of one class to another? Or is grandeur always and inevitably tied to inequality, requiring a concentration of resources that can only exist if most people have little? The 20th century's answer was to reject grandeur almost entirely, to embrace a democratic aesthetic that valued comfort and efficiency over beauty and permanence. This was not an unreasonable choice, perhaps even a necessary one, but it left us with a landscape that lacks the power to move us, that fails to connect us to anything larger than our individual lives. The Phipps Estate, for all its flaws, connected those who built it and those who saw it to a tradition of beauty that stretched back to the Renaissance and beyond. When it fell, that connection was severed, and we're still trying to figure out what should replace it. The trucks that carried the estate's rubble away scattered it across Long Island, some pieces dumped in landfills, others repurposed as fill for new construction projects. Molecules of marble that once formed a grand staircase might now be part of a shopping mall's foundation. Bronze that gleamed in a chandelier might have been melted down and recast into something mundane and utilitarian. The stone walls that marked the estate's boundaries crumble a little more each year, weeds forcing their way between blocks, weather eroding the mortar, gravity patiently waiting to pull everything down. In another generation or two, even these fragments will be gone, and the Phipps Estate will exist only in archives and memory, a story scholars tell each other about an America that once was. And eventually, even the scholars will move on to other subjects, and the story will fade into the general background noise of history, one among millions of forgotten monuments to forgotten dreams. But perhaps, before it fades completely, we owe it to ourselves to sit with the story, to think about what it means that such places could be built and destroyed within a single human lifetime. The Phipps Estate rose because America in the Gilded Age created a system that allowed a handful of men to accumulate wealth beyond imagination while millions lived in poverty and desperation. It fell because that system ultimately proved unstable, unable to sustain itself through depression and war, forced to transform into something more democratic and more just, if only slightly. The estate's brief existence, from groundbreaking to rubble in less than 40 years, mirrors the brief ascendancy of the Gilded Age itself, that moment when America's industrial might seemed to promise unlimited wealth but instead created contradictions that nearly tore the nation apart. We survived that moment by choosing, however imperfectly, a different path, one that rejected the idea that palaces for a few were worth poverty for many. The estate's disappearance is a marker of that choice, a physical manifestation of values shifting, an old world dying so a new one could be born. And what of Henry Phipps himself, the quiet man at the center of this story, the accountant who became a baron, the immigrant son who built a palace? He made his choices, accumulated his fortune, built his monument, and died believing, probably, that he had lived well and done good. He couldn't have known his palace would be demolished before his youngest grandchildren reached middle age. He couldn't have imagined a future where his name would be forgotten except by specialists and local historians. But would he have changed anything if he could have seen what was coming? Would he have been more generous, less focused on accumulation, more willing to share the wealth his workers created? Or would he have built the palace anyway, enjoyed his brief years there, and accepted that nothing lasts forever? These are questions we can never answer, but they're worth asking, because they're not just about Henry Phipps. They're about all of us, about how we choose to live, what legacies we try to build, what we're willing to sacrifice in pursuit of our ambitions, and whether any of it matters in the end. The Phipps Estate is gone. The palace time erased stands nowhere now, exists only in photographs and blueprints and memories growing dimmer with each passing year. But the questions it raises remain, as urgent and uncomfortable as ever. How much wealth is too much? What do we owe to those whose labor creates our comfort? Can beauty justify exploitation, or does exploitation poison everything it touches? How do we honor the past without excusing its injustices? What should we preserve, and what should we let fall? These are not historical questions. These are questions about the world we live in right now, about choices we're making every day. The Phipps Estate fell, but the dynamics that created it persist, just in different forms, and until we honestly reckon with those dynamics, until we build a world where palaces aren't necessary because everyone has enough, the ghost of that lost estate will haunt us. Not as a warning against excess, though it is that. Not as a symbol of impermanence, though it is that too. But as a reminder that every monument to beauty and grandeur is also a monument to someone's labor, someone's struggle, someone's sacrifice. And when we admire beauty or mourn its loss, we have an obligation to remember everyone who paid for it, not just those whose names appeared on the deed.